The smell of scorched oak and expensive champagne usually meant a celebration at the Monroe Distillery. But tonight, the air in the private office tasted like copper and cold sweat. Rachel stood frozen, her fingers digging into the edges of a slate-blue folder she was never meant to see. On the floor, a scattered pile of blueprints showed the historic brick walls of her family's legacy, crossed out with aggressive red digital ink, replaced by the sterile outlines of an industrial warehouse. The heavy grandfather clock in the corner ticked like a countdown, each second echoing through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. The lock on the door clicked shut with a sharp, metallic finality. Rachel looked up to see Jack's silhouette blocking the light from the hallway, his festive smile replaced by the hard, desperate gaze of a man who had already burned his bridges. He didn't move toward her. He simply watched as she clutched the evidence of a month-long betrayal to her chest. Outside, the muffled cheers of the unsuspecting workers still rang through the rafters. But inside the small office, the only sound was the jagged rhythm of Rachel's breathing. As she realized the man standing between her and the exit had already signed away everything she owned. Rachel Monroe stood before the massive oak tun, her lungs filling with the thick, intoxicating atmosphere of the fermentation room. The air carried a heavy weight, a humid mixture of scorched wood and the deep, cloying sweetness of caramelizing sugars. This was the scent of the Monroe legacy, a perfume composed of a century of sweat and precision. Rachel's fingers, stained dark with the crimson residue of sealing wax, pressed the heavy brass stamp into the neck of the first bottle from the Jubilee series. The metal bit into the cooling wax with a satisfying resistance, leaving behind the family crest, a mark of quality that had survived wars, depressions, and droughts. The sharp, metallic clatter of the corking machine echoed through the high-raftered space. But the sound was immediately swallowed by a deafening roar of approval. Dozens of workers, their faces smeared with the grime of the production line and their denim overalls stiff with corn dust, erupted into applause. The vibration of their cheers thrummed through the soles of Rachel's work boots, resonating in the very brickwork of the 1892 distillery. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of grain dust, slanted through the tall, arched windows, casting long golden bars across the polished copper of the stills. Rachel lifted the sealed vessel high above her head. The glass felt cold and substantial against her calloused palm, the amber liquid inside shimmering like a captured sun. As the cheers reached a crescendo, the rhythmic pulse of the machinery seemed to beat in time with the hearts of the laborers, a singular, triumphant anthem for the Monroe dynasty. Jack stepped forward into the center of the tasting hall, his fingers nimble as he stripped the glinting gold foil from the neck of a champagne bottle. A sharp, festive pop ricocheted off the vaulted ceiling, a sound that felt brittle compared to the deep thrum of the distillery. Frothing white foam surged over the rim, spilling across Jack's knuckles and splattering onto the dark, polished parquet floor in sticky droplets. He hoisted a crystal flute high, the bubbles inside dancing with a frantic, artificial energy under the glow of the chandeliers. Jack's voice boomed, projecting a practiced confidence that filled every corner of the room, washing over the gathered crowd with grand promises of eternal prosperity for Monroe and Sons. Rachel stood back, watching the way the light fractured into 1,000 sharp needles through the faceted glass in his hand. His face was flushed, a mask of exhilaration that didn't quite reach his eyes. And the pungent, yeasty aroma of the expensive, sparkling wine clashed with the honest, earthy scent of ancient oak. To Rachel, the air in the hall felt suddenly thin, saturated with a hollow sense of triumph that tasted like copper on the back of her tongue. Rachel slipped away from the noise, her boots silent as she crossed the threshold into Jack's private office. The transition from the bright, raucous hall to the dim, leather-scented sanctuary felt like stepping underwater. She needed more glasses for the guests, and her hand reached instinctively toward the upper shelf of the walnut cabinet. As she stretched, her elbow brushed against the edge of the massive roll-top desk, a surface perpetually buried under a chaotic landscape of ledgers and correspondence. The movement sent a precarious stack of documents sliding. They tipped slowly at first, then cascaded onto the thick Persian rug in a silent white fan. Rachel dropped to her knees, a sigh of frustration escaping her as she began to gather the scattered blueprints and letters. Her fingertips grazed the textured surface of the bond paper, but her hand froze when she spotted a splash of aggressive, unfamiliar color. Tucked into the center of the mess was a heavy, slate-blue folder, its cover stark and corporate, looking entirely out of place among the family's weathered records. Her heart gave a single, hard thud against her ribs. She remained motionless on the floor, the forgotten pages of the distillery's production schedules fluttering slightly in the draft from the hallway. Her focus narrowed entirely onto the folder, where the sharp, geometric logo of Global Spirits was embossed in silver foil. The symbol looked like a predator's eye. Rachel's hand moved slowly, her breath hitching as she flipped open the cover. The dry, clinical hiss of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the sudden stillness of the room. A chill started at the tips of her fingers and raced up her arms as her eyes darted across the dense blocks of legal jargon and the rigid columns of financial projections. She read the section headings: asset liquidation, personnel redundancy, facility decommissioning, and felt a cold stone of dread settle in her stomach. Every word seemed to reek of fresh ink and calculated betrayal. Her grip tightened on the edges of the folder, the heavy cardstock crinkling under her thumbs as the sheer scale of the document began to sink in, turning her breathing into a series of shallow, jagged gasps. Her hands shook as she tore through the subsequent pages, her eyes landing on architectural renderings that made her stomach churn. The blueprints showed the historic brick wings of the distillery, buildings her great-grandfather had laid the foundations for, crossed out with thick, red digital ink. In their place, the plans depicted a series of sterile, windowless corrugated steel hangars labeled Automated Bottling Line for Doines. Rachel's gaze shifted to the cost-benefit analysis. The line items for premium rye and local spring water had been struck through, replaced by bulk purchases of industrial-grade neutral-grain spirit and synthetic oak flavoring. The realization that they intended to turn her family's craft into a factory for rot-gut bourbon made her throat tighten with a physical ache. She ran a hand over the page, her fingers trembling as if she could somehow wipe away the ink. But the numbers remained fixed, a cold, mathematical death sentence for everything she held sacred. On the final page of the folder, Rachel found a signature page bearing a gold-embossed corporate seal. At the bottom, her eyes locked onto a flourish of ink she had seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and business contracts. Jack's sprawling, confident signature. The date written beside it, a full month ago, hit her with more force than the content of the sale itself. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the mahogany walls closing in as the letters blurred into a gray haze. For 30 days, he had sat across the breakfast table from her, smiling and discussing the Jubilee batch, while the ink on this betrayal was already dry. Rachel's fingers spasmed, crumpling the corner of the contract. The rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner transformed into the rhythmic strike of a sledgehammer, each second marking the destruction of the Monroe world as she knew it. The sudden, sharp groan of the door hinges caused Rachel to jump, the blue folder slipping from her nerveless fingers and hitting the rug with a dull thud. Jack stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light of the hallway. The color drained from his face in an instant, his festive, easygoing smile vanishing to reveal a hard, panicked grimace. He stepped into the room with a predatory quickness, his hand reaching back to turn the key in the lock with a definitive, metallic click. Rachel watched the muscles in his jaw bunch and ripple as he stared at her. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between the incriminating documents scattered across the floor and Rachel's accusing face. The air in the small office became stifling, thick with the smell of his expensive cologne and the underlying scent of fear. Jack moved toward her slowly, his shadow stretching across the rug until it climbed her boots and covered her face, cutting off the light from the window. Rachel pulled the folder to her chest, her heart hammering against the paper as he blocked her only path to the door. Rachel tilted her head back, her voice coming out as a jagged, raw rasp as she demanded an explanation for the papers. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he made a sharp, dismissive motion with his hand, as if swatting away a persistent insect. When he spoke, his voice was a cold, clinical blade that sliced through the remaining warmth in the room. He began to speak of market realities and fiscal responsibility, his words coated in a cynical venom. He described the old distillery, her home, as nothing more than an unprofitable anchor and a pile of crumbling masonry that was dragging them both into bankruptcy. Rachel stared at him, unable to recognize the man she had trusted. He shouted over her attempts to interrupt, his face contorting with a sudden, ugly irritation as he dismissed the labor of 3 generations as sentimental trash. The bitterness in her mouth was overwhelming as she listened to him dismantle the worth of the very walls that had sheltered them, walls he had already sold to the highest bidder. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Rachel lunged toward the door, her fingers locking onto the folder with a grip that turned her knuckles white. She had one thought: get these papers to a lawyer, call the sheriff, stop the demolition. But Jack was younger and faster. He threw his weight forward, his elbow catching Rachel hard in the shoulder and bailing her backward. She let out a sharp cry of pain as her spine slammed into the unforgiving edge of the heavy oak desk. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her gasping. Jack loomed over her, his chest heaving, his hands balled into trembling fists. In the dim light, his eyes held the desperate, dangerous glint of a cornered animal. He shifted his stance, his broad frame completely filling the doorway, ensuring there was no way for her to slip past him into the safety of the corridor. Jack took a slow step back, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with a terrifying, calculated calm that chilled Rachel more than his shouting had. His voice dropped to a low, intimate crawl as he informed her that the advance from Global Spirits had already been wired and subsequently spent. He listed his private debts with a shrug, his tone suggesting that the money was simply gone, vanished into the ether of bad investments and high-stakes gambles. Rachel felt the floor beneath her boots seem to liquefy. He spoke the words, "The deal is irreversible," with the finality of a judge passing a death sentence. She looked at the empty crystal glass on his desk, the remnants of his celebratory toast, and realized he had traded their entire future for a temporary reprieve from his own failures. He held out his hands, palms up, a gesture of mock helplessness that was the ultimate betrayal. Under his heavy, triumphant gaze, Rachel felt her last shred of hope dissolve into ash. Her hand shot out, seizing the Jubilee bottle she had so carefully sealed only an hour before. The glass felt unnaturally hot, vibrating with her own suppressed rage. With a violent, fluid motion, she spun and hurled the bottle at the wall directly above Jack's head. The explosion of glass was deafening, a crystalline shrapnel that rained down on the carpet. Dark, fragrant bourbon sprayed across the room, soaking the expensive wallpaper and drenching the shoulder of Jack's tailored suit. Rachel watched, mesmerized by her own anger, as the amber liquid streaked down the wall like heavy, golden tears. The act was a definitive severance. A bridge burned in a flash of glass and alcohol. Jack stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock as the pungent, overwhelming scent of the high-proof spirit filled the office. In that moment, the Monroe dynasty didn't just end. It shattered. Rachel didn't wait for him to recover. She shoved past him, her shoulder hitting his chest with enough force to make him stumble, and bolted through the door. She sprinted down the hallway of the distillery, her lungs burning, ignoring the echoing shouts of her name that followed her out into the cold Kentucky air. The air inside the Municipal Archives Department was stagnant, smelling of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of an overworked photocopier. Rachel didn't wait for the clerk to offer assistance. She reached across the counter and snatched the copy of the updated corporate bylaws from his startled hands. Her eyes scanned the fine print at the bottom of the document, searching for the lie. When she found it, her breath hitched. There, in bold black ink, was her own signature, or a perfect ghost of it. The loops of the R and the M were identical to her own hand, but the slant was too precise, the pressure too uniform. It was the work of a machine or a master forger. Jack had traced her life away, turning her legal authority into a hollow formality without her ever touching a pen. She ran a trembling finger over the fraudulent ink, the smooth paper feeling like a slap to the face. The low, steady hum of the office fan seemed to morph into Jack's mocking laughter, echoing in the back of her mind. The peace of the afternoon was shattered by the rhythmic crunch of gravel, as a line of black SUVs with deep-tinted windows roared toward the distillery's wrought iron gates. The heavy thrum of their engines drowned out the local bird song, and the acrid scent of exhaust began to choke the air, overmastering the sweet smell of fermenting mash. The vehicles came to a synchronized halt, and doors swung open to reveal a phalanx of men in identical gray suits, followed by a line of private security guards whose heavy boots struck the pavement with military precision. The Global Spirits logo, embroidered in silver on their tactical vests, looked like a brand on the skin of the Monroe estate. From the top of the porch steps, Rachel watched as the sun glinted off the polished metal of holsters. The corporate lawyers stepped out, adjusting their ties and snapping open leather briefcases like generals preparing for a final assault on a crumbling fort. Rachel scrambled down the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, and threw her arms out wide to block the path of the lead representative. The man, whose eyes were as flat and cold as slate, didn't even break his stride, forcing Rachel to skip backward to avoid being trampled. Before she could speak, a heavy sheet of paper with the embossed seal of the county court was thrust into her face. The bold black header screamed, "Immediate cease and desist." The representative adjusted his spectacles, looking through Rachel as if she were a ghost or a minor architectural defect. His voice was a dry, monotonous drone as he recited the legal statutes that stripped her of her operational authority. Rachel felt the cold, stiff paper against her palms, the reality of the words sinking in. She was being barred from the very floors she had scrubbed as a child. The security guards moved with practiced efficiency, pushing past Rachel and into the sacred dimness of the distillation wing. She chased after them, her voice lost in the clatter of their gear. As they reached the line of copper stills that were still radiating the gentle warmth of the morning's run, Rachel lunged forward to shield the equipment. Rough hands in tactical gloves caught her by the shoulders and shoved her aside. She watched in horror as the guards began to wrap bright yellow tape, embossed with the corporate logo, around the hand-turned valves and brass gauges. The screech of steel security seals being crimped into place sounded like a physical injury. Rachel clawed at the sleeve of a guard, trying to pull him away from the machinery her grandfather had polished every day of his life. But the heavy fabric slipped through her fingers. The bright, gleaming copper was quickly obscured by plastic zip ties and warning labels, turning her living, breathing legacy into a cold, silent exhibit. From the shadows of the barrel-aging warehouse, a different sound emerged. The heavy, rhythmic tread of work boots. The distillery's laborers, led by the grizzled master of the mash, stepped into the light. These were men and women with grain dust in their hair and hands calloused by honest toil. They carried heavy pipe wrenches, iron grain shovels, and rusted pry bars. A low, guttural murmur rose from them, a collective growl of defiance as they formed a solid wall of denim and flannel in front of Rachel. She looked at their faces, the tight jaws, the eyes narrowed in simmering rage. The air between the workers and the corporate security vibrated with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. Rachel felt the heat radiating from the bodies of her people, a human shield ready to turn the production floor into a battlefield for the sake of the Monroe name. The silence broke with the sickening thud of a security baton hitting a worker's shoulder. In an instant, the room exploded into a chaotic swirl of violence. Rachel threw herself into the center of the fray, her hands outstretched in a desperate, futile attempt to pull the sides apart. Around her, the world seemed to disintegrate. Metal shelving units were toppled, and thousands of empty glass bottles cascaded to the floor, shattering into a sea of glittering, jagged shards. The crunch of glass under heavy boots was a constant, terrifying percussion beneath the grunts of exertion and the cries of pain. Rachel saw the glint of black plastic batons rising and falling, and the air grew thick with the smell of sweat and ozone. She grabbed the belt of one of her men, trying to haul him back as a guard lunged. But the tide of the riot swept her away. The sharp glass bit into the soles of her shoes, a stinging reminder that her family's heritage was being trampled into the dirt. By the time Rachel made it to the balcony overlooking the main gates, the scene had shifted. A massive crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces distorted by an anger she hadn't expected. Instead of a wall of support, she was met by a wall of noise, a cacophony of insults and jeers. The people of Lexington, whose families had relied on the distillery for generations, were waving global spirits flyers that promised massive buyouts and modern infrastructure. "Where's our payday, Monroe?" a man screamed from the front of the pack. A rotted apple flew through the air, narrowly missing Rachel's head and splattering against the brickwork behind her. These people saw her not as a guardian of tradition, but as the only obstacle standing between them and the corporate wealth Jack had promised. Rachel gripped the iron railing until the metal bit into her palms, watching as her neighbors transformed into a pack of hungry wolves. Rachel retreated into her house, the silence of the foyer feeling heavy and suffocating. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and she reached for the tablet on the kitchen counter to order a simple meal. The screen flashed a harsh, repetitive red. Transaction declined. She tried another card, then another, but the result was the same. Every account had been frozen. Frantic, she snatched up the receiver of the landline, but instead of a dial tone, there was only the hollow, dead hiss of a severed connection. Jack had systematically cut every thread that bound her to the outside world. She stood in the center of her darkened living room, surrounded by furniture that suddenly felt like the property of a stranger. The very air in the house seemed to grow thin, and when the light inside the refrigerator flickered and died, Rachel was left standing in the encroaching shadows, a prisoner in her own history. The slow, deliberate thud of Jack's footsteps on the wooden porch boards signaled his arrival. He didn't enter. He stopped at the glass sliding door, silhouetted against the fading twilight. He looked down at her, his expression one of detached pity that was far worse than anger. He idly twirled a heavy ring of keys and his smartphone, the screen glowing like a taunt in the dimness. His voice, carried clearly through the glass, informed her that her personal debts he had manufactured, now exceeded the value of her remaining assets. He made a show of checking his watch, casually mentioning that the utility companies would be cutting the power and water in exactly 40 minutes on his orders. Rachel saw the faint, satisfied curve of his mouth in the shadows. He turned and walked back to his car without another word, leaving her to watch the minutes tick away until the house would be swallowed by the cold and the dark. Rachel sat huddled in her father's old leather armchair, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest as if to hold herself together. A single candle on the coffee table flickered, casting a long, distorted shadow of her figure against the wall. The sudden, violent crash of breaking glass made her scream and bolt upright. A heavy, jagged stone tore through the window frame, trailing a veil of sharp shards that rained down onto the rug. Rachel stared at the rock, where a piece of grimy paper was tied with twine, covered in scrawled obscenities and threats from people she had once called friends. Outside, she heard the fading sound of whistling and the frantic beat of retreating feet. The cold night air rushed through the hole in the window, smelling of damp earth and hostility. The candle flame danced wildly in the draft, threatening to leave her in total darkness while the world outside waited for her to break. A heavy, insistent thumping at the front door broke her trance. On the porch, she found a courier who silently handed her a thick, legal manila folder. Inside, Rachel found a voluntary surrender of land rights, a document designed to strip her of the very ground the distillery stood on. Clipped to the front was a handwritten note from Jack. "Sign this, and I'll make the debt collectors go away." She stared at the list of predatory loans he had taken out in her name, the figures blurring into a nightmare of zeros. It was an ultimatum disguised as a lifeline. He was offering her a way out of the crushing debt, but only if she handed him the keys to the grave of her ancestors. Rachel's fingers tightened on the paper, her fear finally being burned away by a cold, white-hot rage. She didn't hesitate. Rachel held the edge of the surrender agreement over the candle's flame. The fire caught quickly, the orange glow devouring the legal jargon and Jack's printed name. She watched until the heat singed her fingertips, then dropped the blackened, curling remains into the cold hearth. She walked to the broken window, ignoring the glass that crunched under her boots. In the distance, atop the hill, the distillery was bathed in the artificial, blinding glare of corporate floodlights. She could see the tiny, gray-clad figures of the guards patrolling the perimeter of the fence. They were walking on her land, breathing her air. But as she watched the smoke from the burned contract rise into the night, Rachel knew she wasn't done. Rachel fought her way through the dense press of bodies in the town square, the festive atmosphere of the harvest festival feeling like a personal insult. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted nuts, and hot cider, but she barely noticed. Her movement stopped abruptly as Jack's voice, electronically amplified and dripping with false sorrow, boomed from the speakers. He stood on a high, bunting-draped podium, dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. He was telling the crowd about Rachel's tragic decline, speaking in hushed, somber tones about her crumbling mental state and the unbearable delusions brought on by the stress of the business. Rachel saw her neighbors, people who had known her since she was a girl, nodding in sympathetic agreement, their eyes reflecting a mixture of pity and fear. Jack's words about her incapacity hung in the air like a poisonous fog, effectively erasing her voice before she could even raise it. The back door of her house creaked open, and Dr. Harris, the man who had delivered half the children in the county, slipped into the shadowed hallway. His hands, usually so steady, shook as he held out a heavy envelope. He wouldn't look her in the eye. Rachel snatched the paper, her gaze locking onto the clinical letterhead of the Silent Springs Psychiatric Institute. It was a formal commitment order, signed by Harris, detailing a fabricated history of hallucinations and violent outbursts. Rachel felt the chill of the paper against her skin. It wasn't just a medical document. It was a warrant. Harris muttered a string of apologies about difficult choices and professional pressure, but Rachel only saw the glint of the gold watch on his wrist, the literal price of his betrayal. Jack had bought her a one-way ticket to a locked ward, turning her own health into the cage that would hold her while he finished the demolition. Rachel stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the distillery sat. The sky above the hills began to pulse with a sickly, rhythmic orange glow that had nothing to do with the sunset. Below, she saw Jack's silver SUV tearing down the dirt access road, kicking up a massive plume of dry gray dust as he sped toward the highway. She heard the distant, tortured scream of his tires as he took the corner at the base of the hill. The orange light intensified, blooming into a roar of fire that began to eat the night sky. The smell reached her a moment later, the sharp, unmistakable scent of burning peat and high-proof alcohol. Jack was gone, a ghost in the dark, leaving behind a trail of taillights and a fire that was rapidly turning her family's pride into a massive, roaring funeral pyre. A colossal pillar of flame erupted through the roof of the aging warehouse, sending a spray of glowing embers thousands of feet into the air. From her vantage point, Rachel watched the ancient timbers, seasoned by a century of bourbon vapors, ignite with the ferocity of a bomb. The earth-shaking thud of exploding barrels rumbled through the ground, a rhythmic drumbeat of destruction. Jack's plan was as clear as the fire: burn the records, incinerate the forged contracts, and erase the evidence of his theft in a localized inferno. Rachel gasped as the superheated air hit her, the smell of charred oak and vaporized spirit making her eyes water. The insurance payout would be worth more than the distillery itself. She watched the fire tornadoes whip through the rafters, realizing that Jack was willing to turn the world to ash just to ensure she had nothing left to fight for. Rachel grabbed the heavy fire axe from its glass case and swung it with a desperate, primal strength. The padlock on the warehouse's side door shattered, and she plunged into a wall of suffocating black smoke. Inside the office wing, the heat was a physical weight, melting the varnish on the walls until it ran like sweat. She pressed a wet wool scarf to her face, her eyes searching for the silhouette of the old floor safe. Above her, the building groaned, a deep, wooden structural scream as the support beams began to buckle under the weight of the fire. Embers rained down on her hair and shoulders like stinging insects. The walls seemed to pulse with the heat, but Rachel didn't stop. She reached the safe, her fingers screaming as they gripped the scorching metal handle. The ceiling groaned again, sagging visibly, threatening to entomb her in the heart of the Monroe history. She dropped to her knees, her hands frantic as she felt for the hidden latch in the safe's base. Her fingers finally closed around the cold, heavy handle of a reinforced iron lockbox. She hauled it out, clutching it to her chest as if it were a child. Inside were the original handwritten mash bills and the airtight vials containing the unique, century-old yeast strains, the soul of Monroe bourbon. Around her, the world was ending. Shelving units collapsed in a spray of sparks, and the floorboards began to curl. She navigated the maze of fire, her instincts guiding her through the blinding haze. A wall of flame blocked the main exit, but she spotted a narrow gap beneath a fallen archway. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, but she tightened her grip on the box, the only thing that could bridge the gap between the ashes of today and the possibility of tomorrow. In the center of the main corridor, where the fire had yet to fully take hold, Rachel ran headlong into Jack. He stood framed by the smoke, his face a distorted mask of soot and sweat, a half-empty gasoline canister dangling from his hand. He froze, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated malice. Rachel could see the way the heat was blistering the paint on the walls behind him. He didn't look at her face. His gaze was fixed on the iron box she held. He took a step toward her, his boots crunching on the fallen plaster. The fire roared in the rooms on either side of them, but in that corridor, the world narrowed down to the two of them and the records of a dead dynasty. Jack lunged. His fingers, slick with sweat and grime, clamped around Rachel's throat, pinning her against the blistering brick of the wall. She gasped for air, her vision tunneling as he used his other hand to claw at the iron box. His voice was a high, frantic shriek that barely carried over the roar of the fire. He screamed that he would burn the papers and her along with them. He shook her violently, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and panic. He ranted that without those recipes, she was nothing but a crazy bitch in a burnt-out shed. Rachel felt his fingernails dig into her skin, drawing blood. The light from the flames danced in his eyes, making him look like something birthed from the inferno itself. He threw his entire weight against her, trying to crush the life out of her before the building did it for him. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Rachel swung the heavy iron box. The corner of the metal caught Jack squarely in the temple with a sickening, wet thud. His grip on her throat vanished instantly, and he stumbled back, his eyes rolling. At that exact moment, the ceiling above them gave way. A massive, charred oak vat, still partially filled with flammable liquid, crashed through the floorboards. The wood disintegrated on impact, and a literal river of burning alcohol surged across the floor. The blue-white flame created an impassable wall between them. Rachel watched through the shimmering heat as Jack fell into the path of the burning spirit, his screams lost in the sudden, thunderous roar of the renewed fire. She didn't stay to watch. She turned and sprinted toward a breach in the outer wall, the smell of ozone and singed hair clinging to her as she leaped into the night. Rachel tumbled through the jagged opening of a first-floor window, hitting the wet, muddy grass with a jarring impact. She stayed down for a moment, gasping for air that didn't taste of ash. The crowd of townspeople, drawn by the sirens and the glow, fell silent as she pushed herself to her knees. She was a nightmare vision. Covered in soot, her clothes in tatters, her skin mapped with burns and scratches. But she held the iron box to her chest with a ferocity that stopped the nearest firemen in their tracks. She watched as the main tower of the distillery collapsed in a spectacular fountain of sparks. The water from the hoses seemed pathetic against the scale of the destruction. She tasted blood and soot on her lips. The townspeople moved back, their eyes wide as they looked at the woman Jack had called insane, who had just walked out of the mouth of hell with the heart of their town in her hands. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped through the mud, his polished shoes looking absurd against the debris. He was a senior counsel for Global Spirits. He didn't look at the burning building. His focus was entirely on Rachel. He adjusted his tie with a clinical, detached motion and reached into his breast pocket. Without a word, he held out a crisp, white business card. His voice was a dry, professional rasp as he reminded her that the corporate board still expected her signature on the final dissolution papers by morning. He spoke as if the fire were merely a minor scheduling conflict. Rachel looked from the card to the smoldering ruins of her life, then back to the lawyer's cold, expectant face. Rachel's boots clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones of the town square, each step leaving a faint, gray smudge of ash on the historic pavement. The Harvest Festival was in full swing, but as she approached, the festive chatter died away like a failing engine. The townspeople, gathered around displays of pumpkins and handmade quilts, turned to stare. She was still a ghost of the fire. Her face mapped with red burns, her hair a matted, smoky tangle. She clutched the blackened iron box to her chest, the metal cool now, while her other hand gripped the case of yeast vials. The morning sun was bright, cruelly highlighting the charred ruins of her clothes. She walked through the parting crowd, the only sound the faint, rhythmic clinking of the glass vials, a sound that felt as heavy as a funeral bell. Jack stood on the raised wooden dais, a microphone in one hand and a promotional glass of Monroe Gold in the other. When he saw Rachel, the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the boards. He lunged for the microphone stand, the speakers emitting a piercing, electronic shriek that made the crowd flinch. His voice was a frantic, ragged edge as he began to scream at the police officers on the perimeter. He pointed a shaking finger at Rachel, yelling that she had escaped from the psych ward, that she was unstable and dangerous. His face was a mask of pure, naked panic. He pleaded with the crowd to ignore her, to see her as nothing more than a burnt-out lunatic trying to ruin their celebration with her madness. Rachel didn't say a word. She ignored the security guards who tried to intercept her, her sheer, focused intensity forcing them to hesitate. She vaulted onto the edge of the stage, the wood groaning under her weight. With a definitive thud, she slammed the iron box onto the main table, right in front of the row of television cameras. Her blistered fingers moved with a terrifying precision, flipping through the soot-stained pages of the internal corporate memos she had rescued. She found the specific manufacturing quotas and slammed the page down. She pointed to the chemical additives list: the high-fructose corn syrup, the artificial wood flavoring, the industrial ethanol. The journalists surged forward, their lenses zooming in on the Global Spirits letterhead. Rachel shoved the documents toward Jack's face, the evidence of his plan to poison the brand for a quick profit laid bare for the entire state to see. She reached back into the box and pulled out her great-grandfather's personal journal, its leather cover cracked and smelling of old smoke. She flipped it open to a hand-drawn map of the local limestone shelf. Rachel's voice, when she finally spoke, was a low, vibrating growl that carried to the very back of the square. She pointed to the proposed waste management sites marked on the corporate blueprints. She explained, in cold, clinical detail, how their optimized filtration system would dump toxic byproducts directly into the town's primary water table within 18 months. The Global Spirits executives on the stage began to whisper frantically among themselves, shielding their faces from the cameras. Rachel held up the records of the spring's purity, records Jack had intended to destroy. And a low, dangerous rumble began to grow in the throats of the farmers standing in the front row. Jack's last shred of control snapped. He lunged across the table, his hands clawing at Rachel's throat, knocking over the display of commemorative glasses. His face was a dark, swollen purple, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. He screamed into the face of the nearest cameraman, his voice a distorted, ugly sound. He called the town a backwater shithole, and the people ignorant hicks, who wouldn't know the difference between fine bourbon and piss in a bottle. He spat the words out, claiming they deserved the rot gut he was going to give them. Rachel stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his, as his tirade echoed through the speakers and into the stunned silence of the square. The insult he had hurled at his own neighbors hung in the air, a definitive, self-inflicted wound. The first sound was a sharp, lonely whistle from the back of the crowd. It was followed a second later by a heavy, overripe apple that sailed through the air and exploded against Jack's shoulder. The square erupted. The people who had been nodding along to his speeches only an hour ago were now a single, roiling mass of fury. A deafening chant of "Get out!" rose up, a physical force that seemed to shake the stage. Jack backed away, his arms over his head as a hail of festival food and souvenir mugs rained down on him. Rachel watched as the very people he had tried to manipulate tore down his new future banners. The man who had tried to sell the town's soul was now cowering, a broken, pathetic figure retreating from the wrath of the people he had called ignorant hicks. The lead counsel for Global Spirits stepped forward, his face a mask of cold, corporate pragmatism. He ignored Jack entirely, as if the man had already ceased to exist. He pulled a heavy, embossed document from his briefcase and laid it on the table. With a sharp, decisive scratch of his fountain pen, he drew a thick X through the merger agreement. He signed a formal, one-page rescission, returning all land titles and intellectual property to the Monroe estate. He pushed the paper toward Rachel, his eyes conveying a silent, ruthless message. The corporation was cutting its losses and leaving the mess behind. He stamped the document with a heavy, metallic thud, a sound that signaled the end of the occupation. Jack didn't wait for the police. He scrambled off the back of the stage and sprinted toward his silver SUV. A barrage of rotted fruit and clumps of sod pelted the vehicle as he dived into the driver's seat. Rachel stood on the stage and watched as he fumbled with the keys, the crowd swarming the car, their hands drumming a rhythmic, angry beat on the roof. The windshield was quickly obscured by filth. He finally floored the accelerator, the tires screaming as they tore up the festival's grass, narrowly missing a group of onlookers. In the side mirror of the retreating car, Rachel caught a glimpse of his face, wide-eyed, pale, and utterly defeated. He sped out of town, a trail of dust and jeers following him, a man who could never come home again. Rachel remained on the stage as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving her with a hollow, aching exhaustion. The square slowly began to clear, the festival goers drifting back to their lives, leaving behind a landscape of discarded flyers and broken glass. She watched the dust from Jack's car settle on the horizon. She had won, but the victory felt like lead in her stomach. The dynasty was hers again, but it was a kingdom of ash and debt. The Kentucky evening began to cool, and she tasted the salt of a single, silent tear on her lip. The Monroe name was safe, but the man who had been her partner was a ghost, and the silence he left behind was louder than the fire had ever been. She walked back up the hill that evening, the smell of damp ash rising to meet her. The blackened skeletons of the warehouses stood against the darkening sky like the ribs of a dead beast. She ran a hand along the side of a scorched copper still, the metal rough with soot but still solid, still cold. She found a stack of mail on the doorstep of the main office. Not letters of support, but thick stacks of legal notices. Jack had been busy in his final days. He had tied every gambling debt, every overdue supplier invoice, and every personal loan to her name. The numbers were staggering, a mountain of financial ruin that would take her a lifetime to climb. She stood in the center of the ruins, the weight of the legacy pressing down on her shoulders. A crunch of boots on the gravel made her turn. Out of the evening mist, a group of figures emerged. The master of the mash, still wearing his soot-stained cap, was the first to step onto the blackened concrete of the floor. He didn't say a word. He just gripped a heavy sledgehammer in his gnarled hands and looked at the debris. Behind him came the others, the bottlers, the grain shovelers, the mechanics. They carried their own tools, their faces set in grim, quiet determination. They formed a semicircle around Rachel, their presence a silent vow. The master of the mash walked to the first pile of fallen brick and began to heave the heavy stones aside. The rhythmic, metallic strike of a shovel hitting the ground broke the silence, a new heartbeat for the Monroe Distillery. Rachel sat down on the only usulated oak threshold of the warehouse, her legs finally giving out. The master of the mash walked over and wordlessly handed her a bottle. It was one of the old reserve batches, found tucked away in a corner of the cellar that the fire hadn't reached. Rachel pulled the cork with her teeth, the smell of the bourbon, real bourbon, filling her senses. She took a long, burning swallow. It tasted of vanilla, oak, and a century of survival. She looked at the workers, at the ruins, and then out at the dark Kentucky hills. She was alone, she was broke, and she was home.